recycle, 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 Man. 10, 10 little attention on your echo. Echo is the recycling Man. 7 man. BS. Just BS. Your ass. Just on BS. Plastic BS. Plastic ABS.